Welcome back to the show. We're setting aside the usual news cycle today to focus on a massive topic.
A really big one.
It touches technology, economics, sociology. We're going to take a comprehensive look at the complete history of video games.
Right.
We want to trace the lineage from the earliest origins, really, as military research equipment, all the way to what we're now calling the metaverse.
It's a huge timeline to cover, and I think what's often missed in the retelling is that this isn't just a story about entertainment or toys.
No, not at all.
It's a technical and an economic history. We're looking at how a global industry was built, from absolutely nothing.
How it crashed in spectacular fashion.
And then how it was rebuilt into, well, the dominant form of media that we see today.
It's a story of how we moved from a dot on a radar screen to these photorealistic, persistent online worlds.
Yeah.
And to get the full picture, I think we had to dispel the biggest misconception right out of the gate.
Oh, absolutely.
Most people, if you ask them where video games started, they'll say Pong.
Pong. Or maybe the arcades in the 70s.
Exactly. But
Yeah.
the roots actually go back much, much further. We're talking into the 1940s and 50s.
And the framework we need to keep in mind throughout this whole analysis is the convergence of two big forces: technology and consumer behavior.
Okay.
On one side, you've got hardware limitations that are either driving or, in some cases, really hindering innovation. And on the other, you have the changing psychology of how people play.
And maybe more importantly.
And, crucially, how they pay for that play. That's the part that drives the industry.
So let's start the analysis in what we can call the pre-commercial era. We're looking at the years between, say, 1947 and 1970.
This is a time when computers were room-sized giants. I mean, the idea of personal computing was essentially science fiction.
Right. So the earliest known attempt at an electronic game was something called the cathode ray tube amusement device. This was patented way back in 1947.
And you have to understand, this was a strictly analog device. There was no digital computer involved, no code.
So what was it then?
It was essentially simulating missile fire on a radar screen, specifically an oscilloscope screen. You'd have these knobs you could turn to control the arc of a little dot trying to hit a target.
Very much a product of its time.
Completely. A product of the post-war era, taking military technology and just trying to find some other application for it. But it was never mass-produced. It just remained a patent, a concept on paper and in a lab.
Okay, so let's fast forward a decade to 1958. We get something that people actually played. This was Tennis for Two, and it was created by William Higginbotham.
At the Brookhaven National Laboratory, which is a key detail.
Why is that?
Because Higginbotham was a physicist, he wasn't trying to sell anything. He built this simulation on an oscilloscope specifically to entertain visitors during the lab's annual open house.
So it was a PR tool almost.
You could say that, and that distinction is vital. Previous simulations were for research, for military training. Tennis for Two was created purely for amusement.
But the tech was still out of reach for a consumer.
Oh, completely. Technologically, these were still scientific demonstrations. They ran on mainframes and mini-computers that cost small fortunes. There was just no path to commercialize this because the hardware was too expensive, too large for a consumer market.
When you say it was on an oscilloscope, I think people picture, blocky pixels. But that's not right, is it?
Not at all. An oscilloscope uses an electron beam, so what you see is a glowing green dot of light. Higginbotham built a circuit that forced that dot to dance across the screen in an arc. It wasn't drawing a picture in the way we think of graphics.
It was.
It was graphing voltage in real time. The result looked incredibly fluid, totally different from the blocky graphics we'd see decades later.
That brings us to the next major leap, which happened at MIT in 1962. A student named Steve Russell created a game called Space War.
Right, on a PDP-1 mini-computer.
And this game was, it featured two spaceships dogfighting while they were maneuvering around the gravity well of a star.
Oh.
A lot more complex.
Space War
Yeah.
represents a cultural shift, really. It was the first widely shared game. It wasn't sold in a box. The code was circulated among the universities that were lucky enough to have a PDP-1. It established that early culture of programming as a collaborative, shared thing.
It proved computers could be for fun, not just for crunching numbers.
Exactly. It showed they could be used for something other than data processing. But we have to understand the scale here. A PDP-1 cost roughly $120,000 in the currency of the time.
So again, not something you're putting in your living room.
Not even close. It was still completely confined to the ivory towers of academia and research.
To get to the living room, we needed a different approach. We needed Ralph Baer.
Yes.
While he was working at Sanders Associates, which was a defense contractor, in 1966, Baer began developing a television-based interactive game system. By 1968, he had a prototype.
The famous brown box.
A brown box, exactly.
And the key innovation here was the display. Baer's genius was realizing that while very few people had a PDP-1 computer,
Almost everyone was getting a television set.
precisely, the brown box was designed specifically to interact with a standard TV, playing simple games like table tennis and volleyball. This was the bridge from the laboratory to the home.
He had to figure out how to actually manipulate the video signal of a standard broadcast television to display spots of light that a user could control.
A huge technical challenge at the time.
Which leads us directly into the birth of the industry in the early 1970s. And we see two very distinct paths emerging at almost the exact same time.
The arcade and the home console.
On the home front, a company called Magnavox licensed Ralph Baer's brown box and released it as the Magnavox Odyssey in 1972. It was the very first commercial home console.
And it was a primitive machine, even for the time. By modern standards, it's barely recognizable. It could only generate 3 square dots on the screen.
3 dots.
Yeah.
So how did you play a game?
Well, to create the illusion of, say, a tennis court or a haunted house, the system came with these plastic overlays that you had to physically tape to your TV screen.
You're kidding.
Not at all. The machine handled the movement of the dots, but the plastic sheet provided all the graphics. It was a clumsy solution, but it created the category. It established the idea.
So while that's happening, Nolan Bushnell and Ted Dabney were trying to commercialize the space war concept.
Right. They wanted to bring that university experience to the masses.
They created a game called Computer Space in 1971, which was the first arcade video game. The coin-operated machine.
But it was a bit of a flop. It was too complex for the average person in a bar to just walk up and play. Space War was for MIT students.
So Bushnell and Dabney founded a new company.
Atari.
This is where the industry finds its first real phenomenon. Bushnell hired an engineer, Alan Alcorn, and asked him to create a simple table tennis game.
And this was supposed to be just a training exercise.
This was a warm-up project, and that exercise became Pong.
And everything changed.
Released in late 1972, Pong was a smash hit.
Yeah.
But the interesting thing technologically is that Pong did not use a microprocessor.
No, it used transistor logic, or TTL. It was pure hardwired circuitry.
What does that actually mean, hardwired?
Well, think about what that phrase really means. There was no code. There was no software. If you open up a Pong cabinet, you wouldn't find a computer chip running a program.
You'd find.
You would find a map of logic gates, a physical circuit. If Atari wanted to change the speed of the ball, they couldn't just type a new line of code. An engineer had to physically heat up a soldering iron and move a wire.
So it was closer to a clock mechanism than a modern video game.
That's a perfect analogy. The game was the circuit board.
The economic impact of Pong is, it's hard to overstate. It was so successful that it spawned this immediate, massive wave of clones.
Hundreds of them. Companies that made pinball machines, jukeboxes, anything electronic suddenly started manufacturing Pong knockoffs.
And this actually led to the industry's first mini crash around 1974 and 1975.
It did. Because Pong was just a circuit board, it was incredibly easy to reverse engineer. Anyone with some basic electronics knowledge could copy the schematic and build their own.
So the market was just flooded.
It was saturated with identical ball and paddle games. Revenue dropped by 50%. There was no brand loyalty. It was just a race to the bottom on price.
That boom and bust cycle is a pattern we are definitely going to see again.
It's a core theme of the industry's history.
But technology provided a way out of that stagnation. We saw the shift from those discrete circuits to actual microprocessors. And a prime example is Midway's Gunfight, which came out in 1975.
The significance of the microprocessor is that it separated the logic of the game from the physical wiring. Before this, as we said with Pong, the game was the wire.
But with a microprocessor.
You could change the software. You could write a program. This drastically reduced the number of physical components you needed, and it allowed for much, much more complex logic. It paved the way for the concept of the programmable cartridge,
The idea that you could buy one machine and plug in different software to play different games.
the foundation of the home console market as we know it.
So moving into the late 70s, we enter what everyone calls the Golden Age.
The arcade boom.
In 1978, a Japanese company, Taito, released Space Invaders. And this game fundamentally changed the mechanics of play.
It introduced concepts that are completely standard today, but were revolutionary then.
Like what?
Well, first it had high scores. This encouraged competition. It made you want to put another quarter in to beat your friend's score. It had lives rather than just a simple timer.
Right.
It had background music, a simple 4-note loop that sped up as the enemies got closer to the bottom of the screen.
Which increased the tension.
Dramatically. And it had escalating difficulty through waves of enemies. And the interesting thing about that speed increase,
Yes.
it was originally a technical accident. As you destroyed the aliens on screen, the processor had fewer objects to render, so it could run the program faster, making the remaining aliens move faster.
And the developers just realized it made the game more intense and kept it in.
They turned a bug into a feature, a classic story in game development.
Space Invaders was a massive success. And following that, we just saw a parade of icons between 1978 and 1982.
The Mount Rushmore of early gaming.
Yeah, you had Pac-Man, which popularized the idea of characters and mascots.
Yeah.
It expanded the audience beyond the usual, sci-fi shooter demographic.
It brought women and families into arcades in a way that Space Invaders hadn't.
Then you had Donkey Kong, Defender. The financial scale was just staggering. By 1982, arcade revenue in the United States had hit $7.7 billion.
To put that in perspective, that surpassed the revenue of pop music and Hollywood films combined.
Video games were the biggest entertainment industry in the country.
For a brief, shining moment.
So while the arcades were generating billions in quarters, the home market was evolving thanks to that microprocessor revolution.
Right. We saw the release of the Fairchild Channel F in 1976, which was the first cartridge-based system. But the more famous one was the Atari VCS, later known as the 2600.
And the Atari VCS really took off because of what we now call the killer app concept.
The one game that makes you buy the hardware.
And for the VCS, that was Space Invaders. Atari licensed it for the home console. The idea that you could play the biggest arcade hit in your living room. It quadrupled sales of the VCS.
But this incredible success brought its own complications. This is when we saw the birth of third-party developers.
A critical piece of the business history.
Absolutely. At the time, Atari did not credit its game designers. Their names weren't on the box. They weren't in the manual. They didn't get royalty.
They were treated like anonymous assembly line workers.
Exactly. So a group of their star programmers left Atari to form their own company, Activision, in 1979. They wanted credit for their work, and they wanted a piece of the profits.
And this established the model of third-party publishing, where a company could make games for a console that they didn't manufacture.
It opened the floodgates.
But that openness, that lack of control, directly contributed to the Great Crash of 1983.
A cataclysmic event.
This is something that nearly wiped out the entire North American video game industry. Revenues fell from around $3 billion in 1983 to just $100 million by 1985.
A 97% drop. It's almost impossible to imagine an industry collapsing that completely, that quickly.
So if we analyze the causes, what happened?
It was a perfect storm, really. First, you had oversaturation. Because Atari had lost its legal battles to stop companies like Activision, anyone could make a game for the 2600.
So venture capitalists with no experience in gaming just flooded the market with terrible games.
Exactly. There was a complete loss of consumer confidence. You'd spend your money on a game and it would be broken or just awful. Retailers were stuck with huge amounts of inventory they couldn't sell.
The famous story of Atari burying millions of copies of the E.T. game in the desert.
The literal embodiment of the crash. The second cause was competition from home computers.
Right.
Machines like the Commodore 64 offered more utility, you could do your homework, you could do word processing, and you could play games that were often more sophisticated than what was on the Atari. And it was for roughly the same price as a console.
The parent side is a better investment.
A much better investment. It was an educational tool that also played games, versus a toy that only played games.
And the outcome of this crash was brutal. Major players like Magnavox and Coleco just exited the industry completely.
Atari was sold off for parts. For a moment, it really looked like home video games were just a passing fad in the United States, like the hula hoop.
But the center of the industry was shifting. While the U.S. market crashed and burned, the industry in Japan remained relatively stable.
And that brings us to the recovery and the 8-bit era. A company called Nintendo decided to enter the U.S. market in 1985.
With a Nintendo Entertainment System, the NES.
But they were very, very aware of why the crash happened, and they implemented this incredibly strict business strategy to prevent it from ever happening again.
And the most visible part of that was the Nintendo seal of quality.
That little gold seal on the box.
If a game didn't have that seal, it wasn't an official Nintendo product.
And it was more than just a sticker. This was the brilliant part. They used a piece of hardware called the 10NES lockout chip.
So what did that do?
It prevented unauthorized cartridges from working on the system. It was a physical and a digital handshake. The console had a lock, and the cartridge had to have the key. If the cartridge didn't have that chip, the console simply wouldn't boot the game.
Which gave Nintendo absolute control over manufacturing and publishing.
Total control. They also placed strict limits on their third-party publishers. They were only allowed to release 5 games per year.
Which forced developers to focus on quality rather than just churning out quantity.
Exactly. No more shovelware. And it worked. The NES revitalized the market, driven by these iconic franchises. Super Mario Bros., The Legend of Zelda, Dragon Quest in Japan.
But while Nintendo was locking down the living room with this very controlled, curated ecosystem,
a different culture was brewing in the world of personal computers.
We mentioned the home computer threat during the crash, but by the mid-'80s, platforms like the Commodore 64 and especially the ZX Spectrum in Europe had created this unique ecosystem.
In the UK specifically, there was what they called the bedroom coder culture. Games were distributed on cassette tapes, which were incredibly cheap to duplicate and mail. It allowed for a much more experimental, albeit less polished market compared to the walled garden of Nintendo.
And then you had the IBM PC, which was released in 1981. It eventually came to dominate the market because of its open architecture.
Right, which allowed for clones, driving down prices, and encouraging widespread adoption. This was a stark contrast to Apple's closed Macintosh system at the time.
So this split between the open PC market and the closed console market is a dynamic that, it persists to this day.
It's the fundamental business division in the industry.
So as we move into the late 80s and early 90s, the console market heats up again with the 16-bit era. This is the first real console war.
The playground arguments of a generation.
You had NEC's TurboGrafx-16, but the real battle was between the Sega Genesis and the Super Nintendo.
And Sega, in particular, adopted this incredibly aggressive marketing strategy to challenge Nintendo's dominance.
They knew they couldn't beat Nintendo just on brand loyalty. Nintendo owned the market.
So they positioned themselves as the cool alternative, the edgy older brother's console. They used price cuts, and they bundled their new mascot game, Sonic the Hedgehog, with every console.
That's the classic razor and blades business model.
Right. A perfect example. You sell the hardware, the razor, at cost or even at a loss. You just want to get it into as many homes as possible.
To build that install base.
Right. And then you make your real profit on the licensing fees from the software, the blades. Sega also used marketing that directly attacked Nintendo. The famous tagline was, Sega does what Nintendo don't.
Which was unheard of at the time.
It was very aggressive and it worked. They captured a huge amount of market share.
As the 90s progressed, we saw another massive technological shift coming. The move from cartridges to optical media.
The CD-ROM.
The physical limitations of cartridges were really becoming a problem.
They had very little storage space, relatively speaking, and they were expensive to manufacture. A high-end SNES cartridge could cost a publisher $20 or $30 per unit. A CD-ROM cost about $1 to press.
And the storage capacity was just orders of magnitude larger.
Massively larger. And that storage capacity allowed for things like full-motion video or FMV and pre-rendered cinematic cutscenes.
We saw this drive PC adoption with games like Myst and The Seventh Guest, which felt like these new interactive movies.
But in the console space, this transition to CDs led to the rise of a completely new giant.
Lordy.
And the story of the PlayStation is one of the great ironies of the industry. Sony had originally partnered with Nintendo to create a CD add-on for the Super Nintendo.
The Nintendo PlayStation.
Exactly. The deal fell through at the last minute, very publicly, and a humiliated Sony decided to take what they'd learned and just enter the market themselves.
And they launched the PlayStation in 1994.
And they completely dominated the next 2 generations of consoles.
Why? What was the key advantage?
They capitalized on manufacturing speed. Nintendo, for the Nintendo 64, made the strategic error of sticking with cartridges. They were worried about piracy and load times on CDs.
So a Nintendo 64 cartridge took months to manufacture.
Right. If a game sold out, it took months to get more on the shelves. Sony could press millions of CDs in a week. This allowed them to react to the market instantly. They could restock hits, they could take chances on niche games.
This supply chain advantage was as critical as the hardware itself.
Arguably more so.
So alongside this storage revolution, we had the visual revolution, 3D.
The move to polygons.
We went from the wireframe graphics of an old game like Battlezone to the 2.5D tricks of the Super Nintendo era with things like parallax scrolling, and then finally to true, real-time, polygonal 3D.
In the arcades, Sega was really pioneering this with Virtua Racing and Virtua Fighter. These were mind-blowing at the time.
But on the PC, it was the first-person shooter explosion that was changing the landscape.
Yeah.
You had Wolfenstein 3D, Doom.
And then Quake. Quake specifically introduced a true 3D engine with fully 3D models. It moved away from the 2D sprites that were used in Doom. This required a new level of mathematical processing power, which led to the rise of dedicated 3D graphics cards.
We can't talk about the 90s, though, without mentioning handhelds. The Game Boy, released in 1989, was technically inferior to all of his competitors.
Oh, massively. The Sega Game Gear, the Atari Lynx, they both had color screens. The Game Boy had that monochrome green and black screen.
But it absolutely dominated the market.
It proves that raw specs aren't everything. The Game Boy had two killer features: superior battery life
And Tetris.
and Tetris. The competitors with their color screens would devour batteries in a few hours. The Game Boy could run for days on 4 AA batteries. Later, the launch of Pokémon Red and Blue just cemented Nintendo's complete hold on the handheld market, a dominance they held for decades.
So as we cross into the 2000s, the major themes become connectivity and convergence, and a new player enters the fray.
Microsoft with the Xbox in 2001?
What was their motivation for getting into the console business?
It was almost entirely defensive. They looked at the PlayStation 2, which was a runaway success, and they saw it not just as a toy, but as a potential computer in the living room.
A Trojan horse.
A Trojan horse that could displace the PC as the center of home entertainment. They were terrified of that. So they launched the Xbox, which was, under the hood, essentially a PC in a console box.
And its key feature was that built-in Ethernet port.
Yes. That, combined with their killer app, Halo. Combat Evolved drove the success of Xbox Live. It brought online multiplayer, which had been a staple of PC gaming for years, into the console mainstream in a really slick, easy-to-use package.
While Microsoft was rising, Sega was making its exit from the hardware business.
A sad end to that era. The Dreamcast, released in 1998, was actually very innovative. It was the first console with a built-in modem for online play.
But it failed commercially.
It just couldn't compete with the hype and marketing muscle of the upcoming PlayStation 2.
Yeah.
Sega couldn't sustain the hardware losses, and they made the painful decision to pivot to becoming a third-party software publisher.
And then we have Nintendo. After the GameCube struggled against the PS2 and the Xbox, Nintendo took a sharp left turn. In 2006, they released the Wii.
And this is the textbook definition of a blue ocean strategy.
What does that mean?
Instead of fighting in the red ocean of fierce competition over graphics and processing power, which Sony and Microsoft were doing, Nintendo went looking for a new market entirely, a blue ocean of uncontested space.
They targeted non-gamers.
Exactly. They used motion controls with the pack-in game Wii Sports to make gaming intuitive for seniors, for young children, for families. They didn't compete on power, they competed on accessibility. And they sold over 100 million units.
While the consoles were battling it out, a quiet revolution was happening in our pockets.
Mobile gaming.
It started with simple things, like Nokia's Snake in 1997. But the paradigm shift came with the launch of the iPhone App Store in 2008.
This changed the business model of gaming fundamentally. Before this, you had the Flash game era on websites like Newgrounds and social network games like Farmville on Facebook.
But the App Store brought that kind of accessible, casual gaming to mobile. And then in 2009, with the introduction of in-app purchases.
We saw the birth of the freemium model. You give the game away for free, which removes the barrier to entry completely, and then you monetize it through small, voluntary microtransactions. A hugely disruptive and profitable model.
Moving into the 2010s, we see the graphics arms race intensify again. We move to high definition.
The shift to HD was incredibly expensive for developers. Creating art assets for HD resolutions and now 4K resolutions requires massive teams and budgets that run into the hundreds of millions of dollars.
This created the AAA industry as we know it, but it also made the big publishers very risk-averse.
They can't afford to experiment when a single game costs as much as a Hollywood blockbuster to make. They need guaranteed hits.
And that risk aversion created a vacuum.
A vacuum that was filled by the indie resurgence. Independent developers distributing their games digitally through platforms like Steam or Xbox Live Arcade brought back creativity and niche genres that the big publishers had abandoned.
And we saw massive culture-defining hits like Minecraft and Fez coming from tiny teams, sometimes just one person.
Hardware also continued to evolve and sometimes stumble. We saw the Wii U fail spectacularly.
Where did that happen?
The marketing was a disaster. People were confused by the gamepad controller. They thought it was just an accessory for the original Wii rather than a brand new console.
But Nintendo, as they often do, bounced back with the Switch.
A massive success, which brilliantly combined the home and portable markets into a single hybrid device. You could play on your TV, then just lift it out of the dock and continue playing on the go.
We also saw the rise of virtual reality with the Oculus Rift and the HTC Vive, and augmented reality finding a huge mainstream audience with Pokemon Go.
But as the technology improved, the monetization methods became more and more controversial. We moved from buying a game to
Season passes, battle passes, and the most contentious of all, the loot box.
The loot box, or gacha mechanic in mobile gaming, draws directly from the psychology of randomized rewards, of gambling.
And this became a major issue. Governments began investigating loot boxes as a form of unregulated gambling, especially when targeted at children.
The release of Star Wars Battlefront 2 was a specific flashpoint for this controversy, and the massive player backlash led to a significant industry-wide regulatory reevaluation.
That brings us to the modern era, the 2020s. We're currently in the generation of the PlayStation 5 and the Xbox Series X.
The buzzwords now are ray tracing, which is a complex technique for simulating realistic lighting and reflections, and solid-state drives, or SSDs, that virtually eliminate loading times.
But we're also seeing this clash of cultures with the concept of the metaverse and the attempted integration of blockchain technology and NFTs into games.
There has been significant friction and pushback there. Traditional gaming communities have often seen these things as exploitative or environmentally damaging, and they've largely rejected them.
We're also seeing massive industry consolidation. The scale is unprecedented.
Microsoft buying ZeniMax, the parent company of Bethesda, and then the monumental acquisition of Activision Blizzard. Sony buying Bungie, the creators of Halo and Destiny. The independent middle class of publishers is shrinking rapidly.
And right now, we seem to be navigating a post-pandemic correction.
We are. During the COVID-19 lockdowns, the gaming industry saw a massive, unprecedented boom. Everyone was at home playing games. But as the world opened up again, that explosive growth slowed.
So what we've seen recently is a course correction.
A painful one. We've seen significant layoffs across the industry and studio closures, like the well-publicized struggles of the Embracer Group, as the market sort of normalizes back to a pre-pandemic growth trend.
So if we look back at this entire timeline, what does it all mean? We have gone from a missile simulation on a radar screen to persistent online economies where people make a living.
If there's one single conclusion to draw from this whole history, it's that technology drives the medium forward, but it's the business practices that drive the cycles of boom and bust.
Interesting.
The crashes and the booms are almost always a result of quality control and consumer trust. The technology allows for new experiences, but if the business model exploits the player or floods the market with low-quality products, the market will, eventually, correct itself, often painfully.
It's a fascinating evolution, and it's one that is clearly still being written as we speak. We want to thank you for joining us on this analysis of the history of video games.
It was a pleasure to analyze these patterns and see how they repeat.
Thanks for listening.